There comes a moment in life when silence starts speaking louder than words, when distance is no longer protection, but a prison you built without realizing it. And if you're hearing this, it's not random, because something in you has already started questioning the pattern, the pulling away, the hesitation, the invisible wall you keep rebuilding. You ever notice how the strongest looking people are often the ones avoiding the deepest emotional connections? Not because they don't care, but because caring once cost them too much. So they learned a rule: feel less, survive more. But survival is not the same as living. Now listen carefully, because this is where everything shifts. They thought avoidance would protect them. Life, circumstances, and emotional wounds kept reinforcing the same message. Don't get too close. Don't trust it. Stay in control by staying distant. But what they didn't realize is what you avoid does not disappear. It waits. It grows. It repeats itself in fact, different forms until it is finally understood. And here's the truth that breaks the cycle. You are not the same person who was first wounded. But your nervous system doesn't know that yet, so every new connection feels like a replay of an old story. That's why the urge to withdraw comes before understanding even has a chance to speak. But something unusual is happening now. Because for the first time, awareness is entering the pattern. And awareness is the beginning of disruption. That means you are becoming the exception to everything that once defined you. There will be moments when the mind says, step back. When emotion says, disappear. When fear whispers, it's safer alone. But transformation does not begin in safety. It begins in presence. And every time you stay, instead of running, you are rewriting an ancient script. Not with force, not with pressure, but with quiet courage that no one claps for at first. And here is the deeper truth most people never realize. Avoidance, only survives when it is unconscious. The moment you see it clearly, it begins to lose authority over you. Not instantly. Not perfectly, but steadily. You are becoming something rare, someone who doesn't just understand emotional patterns, but interrupts them. Someone who doesn't just analyze pain, but stands inside it without escaping. Someone who doesn't just react, but chooses differently in real time. That is why it feels difficult, because you are not just changing behavior, you are breaking identity-level conditioning. And yes, there will be resistance. Old emotions will rise like they've been waiting for your attention. But don't mistake intensity for danger. Sometimes it is just unprocessed history finally meeting awareness. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are at the exact point where avoidance turns into courage. And one day, without even noticing the exact moment it changed, you will realize something powerful. The things that once made you leave no longer control. In fact, you're staying. Avoidant behavior is not born from emptiness, weakness, or lack of emotional depth. It is often the opposite. It usually begins in a mind and heart that once felt too much, too quickly, or too painfully without the tools to process it safely. When a person experiences emotional intensity that overwhelms their capacity to respond, the nervous system does something incredibly intelligent in the short term, but costly in the long term. It learns distance. It learns that stepping back creates relief. It learns that silence reduces pressure. It learns that emotional withdrawal equals safety. And over time, what started as a protection mechanism becomes a pattern of identity. The person no longer says, I am stepping back because I am overwhelmed. Instead, it becomes automatic. This is just who I am. I don't open up. I don't get too close. I handle things alone. But beneath that identity layer, there is something far more human and far more vulnerable. An unprocessed memory, emotional overload that was never fully healed, only avoided. Avoidance is not the absence of feeling. It is the management of too much feeling without safe containment. Many people assume avoidant individuals don't care deeply, but in reality, they often care deeply enough to fear the consequences of caring. Because somewhere in their past, closeness became linked with loss, disappointment, rejection, misunderstanding, or emotional chaos. So the mind made a decision, not consciously but biologically. If closeness hurts, distance must heal. This is why avoidant patterns feel so automatic. They are not chosen in the moment they are triggered. A certain tone, a shift in emotional expectation, a sign of dependency, or even the possibility of vulnerability can activate the old internal alarm system. And once that system is activated, logic takes a back seat. The body moves first. The emotional system pulls away before the rational mind can even explain what is happening. But what is of fact? 10 misunderstood is that avoidance is not rejection of others, that is protection of self. It is a boundary that was once necessary but never updated. Like a fire alarm that still goes off even when there is no smoke, the system is simply doing what it learned during a time when it had no other strategy. The deeper layer of avoidant psychology is emotional memory. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize away. So even if someone intellectually knows this relationship is safe, their emotional system may still respond as if danger is near. This creates internal conflict, wanting connection but simultaneously resisting it, desiring intimacy but feeling discomfort when it arrives, longing for understanding but retreating when it is offered. This is not confusion of character. It is fragmentation between past emotional conditioning and present reality. The avoidant person is often living in two timelines at once: the present moment where safety might actually exist, and the past emotional imprint where safety was not guaranteed. And because avoidance reduces emotional discomfort in the short term, it reinforces itself. Every time a person withdraws and feels immediate relief, the brain registers that withdrawal as successful problem solving. This is how the cycle strengthens, not because the person is unwilling to change, but because the nervous system has been trained through repetition. However, what makes avoidance so significant is also what makes it reversible. It is learned, which means it can be unlearned. But it requires a shift that goes deeper than behavior. It requires the individual to stay present in moments they were previously conditioned to escape. It requires the ability to notice the urge to withdraw without immediately obeying it. And most importantly, it requires building internal safety where external validation used to be the only anchor. Avoidant psychology begins to soften when the person realizes that the original threat is no longer present, even though the body still reacts as if it is. That realization does not instantly erase the pattern, but it introduces a gap between trigger and response. And in that gap, change becomes possible. Because the moment you can observe your withdrawal instead of becoming it, you are no longer fully controlled by it. Emotional withdrawal rarely appears out of nowhere. It is almost always the end result of repeated emotional overwhelm, where the mind and body reached a point of saturation and had to choose between staying exposed or stepping away to survive. When someone has been emotionally flooded, whether through rejection, criticism, inconsistency in care, betrayal, or simply being misunderstood during vulnerable moments, the internal system begins to associate emotional expression with risk. And once that association is formed, withdrawal becomes a learned response that feels protective, even when it creates distance from connection. At its core, emotional withdrawal is not a disinterest. It is about regulation. When emotions feel too intense, too unpredictable, or too unsafe to express openly, the nervous system seeks control by reducing exposure. That reduction can look like silence, avoidance of deep conversations, changing the subject, physical distancing, or even numbing out internally while still being physically present. From the outside, it may appear as detachment, but internally it is often a form of self-stabilization. What makes emotional overwhelm so impactful is that it doesn't need to happen constantly to leave a deep imprint. Sometimes a few highly charged experiences are enough to shape a long-term pattern. A moment where vulnerability was met with judgment instead of understanding. A time when openness was used against someone. Or an experience where emotional needs were dismissed, minimized, or ignored. The brain does not interpret these events as isolated incidents. It often generalizes them into rules about safety. And those rules questioned. ITELY shape future behavior. So when a similar emotional situation arises again, even if the present environment is different, the body reacts based on the past. The heart may want closeness, but the nervous system remembers discomfort. This is why emotional withdrawal can feel automatic. It bypasses conscious decision-making. The person may not even fully understand why they suddenly feel the urge to pull away. They only feel the internal shift: tightness, irritation, fatigue, numbness, or a sudden need for space. And in that moment, withdrawal feels like relief, not avoidance. But what is often misunderstood is that emotional withdrawal is not emotional absence. In many cases, people who withdraw are highly sensitive internally. They feel deeply, sometimes more deeply than they can express in real time. The withdrawal happens because the internal experience is stronger than the external capacity to process it. There is too much happening inside and not enough perceived safety or structure. Effect. Create to release it outwardly in a regulated way. So the system shuts down expression as a way to prevent escalation. This is also why emotional withdrawal can create confusion in relationships. To others, it may seem like inconsistency, moments of closeness followed by sudden distance, but internally, it is often a cycle of engagement and overload. Connection feels good until it reaches a threshold where vulnerability becomes too activating. Then distance becomes necessary to restore equilibrium. Once calm returns, the desire for connection may reappear again, creating a push-pull dynamic that feels difficult to understand from the outside. The key element driving emotional withdrawal is not lack of feeling, but lack of emotional containment. When someone has not learned how to hold intense emotional states without becoming overwhelmed, those states feel dangerous. So instead of processing emotions through expression, reflection, or shared understanding, the system defaults to reducing. Fact, input, less conversation, less exposure, less engagement. This creates a temporary sense of control, but it also limits emotional integration. Over time, this pattern can shape identity. A person may start to believe they are simply not emotional, not expressive, or someone who prefers distance. But these labels often mask a deeper truth. The emotional system is active but guarded. The withdrawal is not proof of emotional emptiness, it is evidence of emotional protection. Another important aspect of emotional withdrawal is that it is often reinforced by misunderstanding. When others interpret withdrawal as rejection and respond with frustration, pressure, or emotional pursuit, it can intensify the original pattern. The nervous system, already overwhelmed, now associates emotional expression not only with internal discomfort but also with external pressure. This strengthens the need to retreat further. What was meant to bring closeness can unintentionally deepen distance. Healing. Fact. G begins when this pattern is seen clearly without judgment. When emotional withdrawal is recognized not as a character flaw but as a learned survival response, the internal tension starts to shift. Because the system no longer needs to defend an identity, it can begin to understand a mechanism. And in that understanding, the possibility of staying present during emotional intensity slowly becomes more accessible. Healing does not begin with perfection, and it does not begin with suddenly becoming emotionally fearless. It begins at a far more subtle and often overlooked point: awareness without judgment. The moment a person starts to see their own patterns clearly, especially the ones they once used, to protect themselves, they step into a completely different relationship with their inner world. Before awareness, behavior feels like identity. After awareness, behavior becomes something observable, something that can be understood, questioned, and gradually reshaped. For someone who has fact, Ived with avoidance or emotional withdrawal patterns, self-judgment is usually the first barrier to healing. The internal dialogue often sounds harsh, even if it is quiet. Why am I like this? I should be better by now. Other people can handle this. Why can't I? These thoughts do not create change. They create pressure, and pressure does not dissolve avoidance, it strengthens it. Because the nervous system that already associates emotional intensity with discomfort now experiences even more internal tension. Awareness, in its pure form, is very different from judgment. Awareness simply notices. It says, "This is what is happening inside me right now," without labeling it as good or bad, without turning it into a moral issue, without attaching identity to it. And this distinction is what makes awareness powerful enough to create transformation. Because the moment something is fully seen without resistance, it stops operating in the background as an unconscious force. When avoidance, fact, or withdrawal patterns are unconscious, they feel like instant reactions. There is no space between trigger and response. The person feels something uncomfortable and immediately pulls back, often without even realizing the shift until after it has happened. But when awareness enters the process, even in the smallest way, a gap begins to form. In that gap, something new becomes possible. Not immediate change, but choice. At first, awareness does not eliminate the urge to avoid. The urge still appears, often just as strongly as before. The difference is that now it is recognized. A person might notice, "I feel like shutting down right now." That recognition may last only a second or two, but it is significant. Because for that brief moment, the individual is no longer fully identified with the reaction. They are the one observing it. This shift from being inside the reaction to observing the reaction is the foundation of emotional transformation. It does not require force. It requires respect, clarity, and clarity grows through repetition. Every time a pattern is noticed without immediate self-criticism, the brain begins to map it differently. Instead of "this is who I am," the internal system starts to register. "This is something I do when I feel this way." Self-judgment interrupts this process because it collapses awareness back into identity. When a person judges themselves for avoiding, the mind stops observing and starts defending, either through shame or justification, both of which remove the space needed for change. But when judgment is removed, even if only temporarily, the system remains open long enough for understanding to deepen. Understanding is what slowly transforms automatic behavior. When someone begins to see the conditions that trigger their avoidance, certain tones, expectations, emotional intensity, or vulnerability, they start to anticipate patterns before they fully activate. Not to control them, but to recognize them earlier. An earlier recognition, fact, usually creates more space than late reaction. Over time, awareness also changes the emotional relationship with discomfort. Instead of immediately interpreting discomfort as danger, the mind begins to see it as information. Discomfort becomes a signal, not a command. It indicates activation, not necessarily threat. This subtle reframe is powerful because it reduces the urgency to escape. And when urgency decreases, the nervous system is less likely to default into withdrawal. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs when awareness is practiced consistently. The individual begins to realize that thoughts and impulses are not instructions, they are events in the mind. A thought like, "I need to pull away," can be seen as a mental occurrence rather than an absolute truth that must be acted upon. This separation between thought and action is where freedom begins to emerge. But perhaps the most important aspect of awareness without judgment is that it creates emotional safety inside. Earnestly. Instead of the mind becoming another source of pressure, it becomes a space of observation. And for a system that has long relied on avoidance as a way to escape overwhelm, internal safety is what allows new responses to form. Because the nervous system does not change through force, it changes through repeated experiences of safety in previously triggering moments. So healing does not demand that a person immediately stop avoiding. It asks something more foundational: to see the avoidance clearly, repeatedly, and without turning it into self-punishment. Each moment of clear, non-judgmental awareness becomes a small interruption in an old pattern. And over time, those interruptions accumulate into something stronger than the pattern itself. Consistency in emotional presence is one of the most underestimated forces in psychological transformation. People often look for breakthroughs, intense realizations, or dramatic changes. But avoidance patterns are not broken by intensity. In fact, they are softened and reshaped by repetition, by showing up emotionally in small, steady ways that gradually teach the nervous system a new language of safety. Emotional avoidance is built through repetition of withdrawal under stress, and it can only be dismantled through repetition of presence under similar conditions. When someone has lived with avoidant tendencies, emotional inconsistency often feels normal internally. There may be moments of openness followed by sudden retreat, moments of engagement followed by emotional distance. This is not random, it reflects the internal rhythm of comfort and overwhelm. But healing requires interrupting that rhythm, not by forcing constant exposure, but by gradually increasing the duration of emotional presence before the system defaults to withdrawal. Emotional consistency does not mean being intensely expressive all the time. It means staying present with emotional experience long enough for the nervous system to realize that it is safe to remain engaged. Even if discomfort is present, even if the urge to withdraw appears, consistency means not immediately obeying that urge. It means extending the moment of presence by just a little bit more than before. That small extension is where rewiring begins. At first, this consistency feels unnatural because the system is used to resolution through escape. If emotional intensity rises, withdrawal previously provided relief, so staying present initially feels like ignoring a signal. But in reality, it is retraining the signal itself. The nervous system begins to learn that emotional activation does not always require escape. It can rise and fall without leading to collapse or overwhelm. The key factor here is repetition over time. One moment of staying present does not rewrite deeply embedded emotional conditioning. But repeated moments create a new pattern that slowly competes with the old one. Each time a person remains emotionally available instead of withdrawing even briefly, in fact, they are sending a new message to their internal system. This feeling can be experienced without leaving. Over time, that message becomes more credible than the old one that said, "I must step away to be safe." Consistency also builds tolerance. Emotional tolerance is not something people are born with in fixed amounts. It is developed through gradual exposure to internal experience without avoidance. When someone consistently allows themselves to stay in contact with emotional discomfort, whether it is vulnerability, uncertainty, or relational closeness, the nervous system expands its capacity to hold that experience. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once triggered withdrawal begins to feel survivable. Another important aspect of emotional consistency is trust. Not just trust in others, but trust in oneself. Avoidant patterns often weaken self-trust because actions become reactive rather than intentional. A person may later look back and wonder why they were drew, why they shut down, or why they distanced themselves again despite wanting connection. This creates internal fragmentation. Consistency repairs that fragmentation by aligning intention with behavior over time. When someone repeatedly chooses to remain present, even imperfectly, they begin to trust that they can stay with their own emotional experience without abandoning themselves. There is also a relational impact. Emotional consistency in one person changes the dynamic of connection itself. When others experience steady presence instead of unpredictable withdrawal, the environment becomes less triggering. There is less need for emotional pursuit or fear of sudden distance. This creates a feedback loop where safety becomes mutual rather than one-sided. And mutual safety reinforces the individual's ability to remain present even further. However, consistency does not mean rigidity or emotional suppression. It does not mean forcing oneself to stay engaged beyond capacity. That would, in fact, recreate overwhelm, which is the original cause of avoidance. Instead, consistency is about gradual expansion, staying present a little longer than last time, noticing the threshold, and building familiarity with it rather than bypassing it. It is a process of calibration, not coercion. One of the most transformative realizations in this process is that emotional presence is not a permanent state, it is a practiced skill. Just as avoidance was learned through repeated responses to discomfort, presence is learned through repeated experiences of staying with discomfort without escaping it. This reframes healing from something abstract into something practical and embodied. Over time, consistent emotional presence begins to alter perception itself. Situations that once felt threatening start to feel less charged. Emotional closeness that once triggered withdrawal begins to feel more neutral or even supportive. The nervous system no longer reacts purely based on past associations because, in fact, new experiences have been layered on top of them repeatedly enough to create alternative pathways. In this way, consistency becomes more powerful than insight alone. Understanding why avoidance exists is helpful, but it is repetition of new behavior that actually changes the system. Each moment of staying present becomes a small but significant correction to an old survival strategy, gradually teaching the mind and body that connection does not always require retreat. True transformation does not happen in the moment you decide to change, it happens in the repeated moments where you choose differently, while your old identity is still active inside you. That is the part most people underestimate. They expect transformation to feel like a clear switch, a sudden arrival into a new version of themselves. But in reality, it feels more like contradiction at first. You still feel the fear, still feel the urge to withdraw, still feel the old patterns pulling you back, but something deeper inside, begins to interrupt that automatic reaction. That interruption, repeated over time, is what creates a new self. Breaking identity-level conditioning is not the same as changing behavior. Behavior is what people see on the surface. Identity conditioning is what drives the behavior underneath it. For someone shaped by avoidance, the identity is often built around self-protection, emotional distance, independence, and control over exposure. These are not random traits, they were once survival strategies. At some point, they worked. They reduced emotional pain. They created stability in situations that felt unstable. So the mind recorded them as, "This is who I am." But transformation begins when a person starts to realize something critical. What once protected you can also limit you when it becomes permanent. The same mechanism that kept you safe during emotional overwhelm can keep you disconnected from deeper connection if it is never updated. And this is where identity level change be. Fact. Jin's not by rejecting the old identity, but by seeing it clearly enough that it no longer feels like the only option. When you start breaking this conditioning, you don't suddenly stop feeling the urge to withdraw. Instead, you begin to notice the urge and not immediately obey it. That gap is everything. Because identity is reinforced through automatic repetition. Every time the old pattern runs without interruption, it strengthens the belief this is just how I respond. But every time the pattern is interrupted, even slightly, that belief begins to weaken. This is why transformation often feels unstable at first. A person may stay present one moment and withdraw the next. They may feel open in one interaction and closed in another. This inconsistency is not failure, it is the transitional space between identities. The old system is still active, but it is no longer fully in control. A new response is being tested in real time. What makes this process powerful is that it happens in order. In fact, in Nari moments, not dramatic ones. It is not only in deep emotional conversations or intense situations. It is in small decisions, staying a little longer in a conversation instead of exiting immediately, allowing a feeling to be present without numbing it instantly, choosing to respond instead of disappearing, or simply noticing the urge to shut down without acting on it right away. These moments may seem small, but they directly challenge the structure of avoidance-based identity. Over time, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The nervous system starts to register that not every moment of emotional exposure leads to harm. This is crucial because identity is not only psychological, it is also physiological. The body remembers patterns through repetition. When new experiences accumulate, even gradually, the body begins to update its expectations. What once triggered automatic withdrawal starts to lose its intensity. At the same time, emotional resilience begins to develop. In fact, the kind of resilience that means nothing affects you, but the kind that allows you to stay present even when something does affect you. This is a deeper form of strength because it is not about absence of emotion, it is about capacity to remain engaged with emotion without escaping it. As this continues, the internal narrative also starts to shift. Instead of "I always pull away," there begins to emerge a quieter truth. "I used to pull away, but I am starting to stay." That shift is subtle, but it marks the beginning of identity reformation. Because identity is not changed by rejecting the old label, it is changed by accumulating enough contradictory evidence that the old label no longer fully describes you. There will still be resistance. Old patterns often intensify temporarily when they sense they are being replaced. The urge to withdraw may feel stronger precisely when you are learning to stay. This is not a sign of regression, it is a sign that the conditioning is being challenged. Fact. Jed at its root level. The system resists change because it is unfamiliar, not because it is wrong. And yet, despite that resistance, each moment of choosing differently carries weight. Not because it is perfect, but because it is new. Identity does not transform through single decisions, it transforms through accumulation. Each interruption of the old pattern adds to a new internal record of experience. Over time, those records begin to outweigh the old ones. Eventually, something shifts where the old response no longer feels like the only possible truth about you. It still exists, but it no longer defines you. You are no longer simply someone who withdraws. You become someone who notices withdrawal, questions it, and sometimes chooses to stay instead. That difference may seem small in words, but internally it represents a complete restructuring of identity from automatic reaction to conscious choice. One of the deepest and least discussed aspects of overcoming avoidant psychology. 1. Fact. The realization that emotional healing does not happen in isolation from fear, but through your relationship with fear itself. Most people assume fear is a signal to retreat, a warning that something is wrong, or a confirmation that they are not ready. But in truth, fear is often just the nervous system encountering something unfamiliar while still carrying old emotional memories. And when you begin to understand fear differently, you stop treating it as an enemy and start recognizing it as a threshold. For someone shaped by avoidance, fear is not just a feeling, it is a direction. It tells the body to move away, to disconnect, to reduce emotional exposure. Over time, this reaction becomes automatic. The moment emotional closeness, vulnerability, or uncertainty appears, Fear activates instantly, and withdrawal follows almost immediately. It happens so fast that it feels like instinct. But what feels like instinct is actually learned repetition stored in the nervous system, the transfo effect. Rationing begins when you stop interpreting fear as a command and start seeing it as a signal that you are approaching a boundary your system has not crossed safely before. That boundary is not necessarily dangerous, that is unfamiliar emotional territory. And unfamiliar does not mean unsafe, even though the body often confuses the two. When you stay present in the presence of fear, something important happens internally. At first, fear intensifies. This is expected because the system is used to fear being followed by escape. So when escape does not happen, the mind and body escalate the signal, almost as if trying to convince you to return to the old pattern. But if you remain steady, not forcing yourself, not suppressing the feeling, simply staying aware of it, something begins to shift beneath the surface. The intensity starts to peak, then plateau, and eventually soften. This process teaches the nervous system a new lesson. Fear can rise without needing to control behavior. It can be experienced and said without requiring withdrawal. This is not a mental concept, it is a lived physiological experience. And once the body learns this even a few times, the rigid connection between fear and avoidance begins to weaken. Over time, fear loses its authority. It is still present, but it is no longer the sole decision maker. Instead of instantly reacting, there is a moment, sometimes very brief, where awareness appears before action. In that moment, a choice becomes possible. Not a perfect choice, not a fearless choice, but a conscious one. This is where real transformation starts to become visible. Because the goal is not the elimination of fear, but the ability to remain present while fear exists. Fear does not disappear in the process of healing, it becomes integrated. It becomes something you can feel without immediately obeying. As this continues, you begin to notice something even more profound. Fear that once signaled danger begins to signal growth. Emotional closeness that once triggered effect. Withdrawal begins to feel challenging but not threatening. Vulnerability starts to feel like exposure at first, but gradually becomes familiarity. The nervous system is not removing fear, it is reclassifying it based on repeated safe experiences. This is why staying present during fear is so powerful. Every time you remain instead of retreating, you are not just resisting an old habit, you are rewriting the association between emotional intensity and safety. You are teaching your body that discomfort does not automatically equal harm. And this is one of the foundational shifts in breaking avoidant patterns. There will still be moments when fear feels overwhelming, especially in the beginning stages of change. That is because the system is adjusting its expectations. It is testing whether the old rule still applies. But each time you remain present, even imperfectly, you reduce the credibility of that old rule. And slowly, fear begins to lose its ability to dictate behavior. Eventual effect. Something changes in your internal experience. Fear is no longer the wall that stops you, it becomes the doorway you can stand in without running through or away from it. And in that space, where you are neither escaping nor collapsing, a new kind of emotional strength begins to form. Not the strength of avoidance, but the strength of presence under pressure. And so, as this understanding settles within you, the real shift is no longer about fighting your patterns, but seeing them clearly enough that they no longer define your direction. What once made you withdraw begins to lose its authority as presence grows stronger than protection. You are no longer just reacting from old conditioning, you are learning to respond from awareness, stability, and inner truth. And in that quiet evolution, something powerful is happening. You are becoming the one who stays, the one who understands, and the one who transforms what used to control them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. With openness, and may you continue forward with clarity, courage, and calm strength. Goodbye.